Welcome to another edition of Foreign Affairs Focus. My name is Gideon Rose. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs, and we have the great pleasure to be here today with Ian Bremmer, the president of Eurasia Group and the author of the brand new book, Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. Now, the G0 concept first made its major public airing in a Foreign Affairs article with you and Nouriel Roubini. So tell us about the book. What is a G0 world and who are the winners and losers in it?
Well, everyone today is writing about how the United States is in decline or not. China is going to be the next superpower or not. Very interesting academic and theoretical conversations for down the road. Right now, the real question is, where's the global leadership? That's what we're experiencing today. And the G0 is the reality of the present world order. It's not that the United States is doing the kind of lifting it has historically. It doesn't have the will, and it has less of the capabilities. But nobody else is going to step up and play that role. That is true whether you look at Europe and the European crisis, whether you look at Syria and the ability and willingness to in any way try to help resolve that. We've had a G7 world for a very long time, with the world's developed countries playing the role of guardians of the international architecture. Once the 2008 financial crisis hit, that fell apart. But the G20 was aspirational. The notion that you'd take the world's 20 largest countries and that together they would provide some form of public goods, whether that's true on climate or trade or currency or what have you. The reality is a little bit more prosaic. It's that we don't have that kind of cooperation or leadership, and so we're left with G0.
So is this basically a massive global collective action problem?
I think it is, and it's also what I would say geopolitical creative destruction, right? I mean, in the marketplace, you have creative destruction all the time. If you've got an independent bookstore and Borders or Barnes & Noble comes around, you better adapt or you're going to die. If your Barnes & Noble or Borders and Amazon comes around, you better adapt, you're going to die. That happens all the time in the marketplace, and we're used to it. In fact, we profit from it. It doesn't happen much geopolitically. In fact, it hasn't happened since World War II. But the underlying power structure of the world has shifted dramatically in the last 30 years, from the United States towards China, from the developed world towards the developing world, and from the debtor states towards the creditor states. But the international architecture, which was formed by, created by, funded by the United States, has not changed to reflect that. And so that imbalance over the past decades, once you had a shock of suitable magnitude, was going to cause that creative destruction. Now, we've had some shocks. We had the end of the Soviet Union, wasn't big enough. We had 9/11, wasn't big enough. Then we had the 2008 financial crisis, which really was the birth of the G0. That was big enough, and that's what we're experiencing.
So is this a transitional period between the old order and some new order, or is it just an open-ended period of no order?
I think it is a transition. I don't think this is the new order. I think it's an interregnum. I think that the world hates a vacuum just as nature does. But I don't think it's yet clear what that transition is moving towards. And I think part of the reason why people are so discomfited by the level of uncertainty in both the global political order and the global economic order today is because even though we're kind of getting through the European crisis, even though the United States is getting through its own financial crisis and rebounding, albeit anemically, we're not comfortable that we know what comes next.
Your last book was on the end of the free market and the rise of state capitalism. The idea that certain kinds of traditional Western neoliberal models were no longer as successful, and certain other kinds of state capitalist models were coming up on the outside. Who are the winners and losers in this new world? Is it the sort of Chinese state capitalist model, or is it somebody else?
I don't think the Chinese state capitalists are winners in the G0 environment. I don't think the United States is a loser. As I sort of said at the beginning, I think the notion that this is about the U.S. versus China is premature. The United States is the world's largest economy and military by far. It will be for a long time. The Chinese are growing very substantially. They need to transition radically to continue that trajectory over the long term, but that will take time too. For the foreseeable future, for the next few years, we're in an environment where the U.S. and China will both be very significant numbers 1 and 2 in the global economic scene. Winners and losers, though, The winners over the last decades were all of those countries that aligned themselves to the United States-led globalization scheme. In a G0 environment, those aren't winners. In a G0 environment, winners are countries and companies and sectors that can adapt, that can hedge. In terms of countries, I call them pivot states, right? So these are countries that don't get captured by individual models of integration, by individual countries. Mexico doesn't pivot. If you look at trade, remittances, tourism, drugs, Mexico is really all about just a bet on the United States. But if you look at Canada, whether or not Obama does the Keystone XL pipeline, I know 1.3 billion Chinese that would like to build an energy bridge to China. They have much more flexibility. This also makes clear that it's
So
not
we have
about
to worry about the Canadians turning away from us?
Oh, I think it's very clear. I mean, look, Foreign Minister Baird told me that he was very proud that his first trip as foreign minister was not to Washington, Beijing. They understand they have options. I'm not saying that Canada is suddenly going to become an enemy of the United States, far from it. What I'm saying is that if the United States model turns out in 5 or 10 or 20 years to not be as successful as it has been over the past many decades, the Canadians have options. The Mexicans don't. This is much more important in other parts of the world where you're not linked to the world's largest economy, where it's a matter of being linked or not to Russia or to China, countries that are much more volatile and whose trajectories are much less certain. And there you have a pivot state in a place like Turkey, where Ukraine would love to pivot, but they can't. And so your winners and losers are not about the BRICS anymore. They're not about the N11 or the next slightly crappier emerging markets you can invest in, but they have more growth. They're actually about countries, companies that have much more flexibility in an environment that's much more volatile, where risks are much greater. You're focusing less just on growth, but you need growth and resilience together, and that means the ability to hedge.
The next president calls you in the day after the election in November and says, okay, I read your book, I buy your concept. What do I, as the leader of the United States, do to adapt to this new situation?
Well, first, you pick and choose your battles very carefully. In an environment where no one's going to provide leadership, the U.S. is still the biggest country out there. There are fewer places that the U.S. is going to make that leadership known. Understand where you want to be that leader of last resort. You want to be the lender of last resort, we get to be the leader of last resort too. Be clear about that. Don't apologize for the fact that we're not putting a large ideological doctrine in place. You need to be more flexible as the U.S. You need to be more opportunistic. You need to be more tactical in this environment. I think that's okay too. But of course, the obvious point is that creative destruction occurs not so frequently. But we're fortunate to live in a G0 environment now as opposed to in 20 years' time, right? If the big shock had not been 2008, but had been in 2018, the U.S. comparative power base would have eroded much more significantly than it has already. That means the ability of the United States to help determine what kind of outcomes the next world order will be much more favorable than you'd see otherwise. And we need to decide. We need to play a very significant proactive hand in what comes post G0. We need to decide if we want institutions to be more inclusive but more shallow, or we want them to be less inclusive but actually much more deep. So do we want a World Bank that has other countries in it that don't share our values but are included, have more voting rights, give them the ability to have the presidency and the rest? Or do we want to kick some countries out? Do we want to be less inclusive, but do we want to actually make that organization much more reflective, much more robust of the values and principles that are important to us? I think that on trade we're already making that kind of a decision. We're not pursuing Doha with extraordinary aplomb. We're looking to do the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is a smaller trade organization, but it's one that includes a bunch of countries that share our sensibilities on trade. We're going to need to be much more explicit about that, not just to our own people, but to our allies. And we're going to need to understand how consistent we want to be in applying that across very different kinds of issue sets. Those are the things I would tell to our next president, whether it's the same one or whether it's Mr. Romney.
Ian Bremmer, president of Eurasia Group, author of Every Nation for Itself, a guide to the G0 world and perhaps what comes after. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, Gideon.